Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about 90s music memories. I was a teenager in the 90s. I turned 10 years old in 1992. So, my entire teen years were the 90s. Um, so, um, this was the time period where I was discovering music. Now, um, how we got to the 90s, in the 70s, rock and roll was going through a transformation. You had two primary movements in rock and roll in the 70s. You had the counterculture movement, which was getting more experimental stuff like what would become prog rock and punk rock and stuff like that. And then you had the more mainstream rock, which was getting harder and edgier, which is where we started to get the seeds of heavy metal and thrasher and that kind of the real rebellious rock. Now you still had your basic rock and roll, regular pop rock, just basic rock and roll bands in the 70s. The 80s, the 70s also gave us disco, which was the seeds to what would become electronic music. The 80s were all about synth pop, and the heavy metal was like electric guitars with a lot of production and effects, echoes, and just like big sounding rock songs. You had things like distortion was getting added to the music, and wah wah pedals were getting used more and more, and electronic effects were being used a lot. And then in the 90s, we had a couple of different movements that I've already talked about, the grunge movement in a previous video. But we also had the evolution of the dance pop movement, which begun in the 80s but really came into its own in the 90s. Hip hop started in the 70s, went through its growing pains in the 80s, and then, matured into adulthood in the 90s. Motown started mostly in the 60s, carried on into the 70s and 80s, and matured into a full-fledged thing in the 90s. Fully mature R&B became like a mainstream form of music in the 90s. You had two movements that were clashing in the 90s. You had the progressive movement that was trying to use technology, advancements in technology, to create new experimental sounds, things like drum machines and computers for creating, looping music, new digital effects, things like that, using samples and stuff like that. But you had the counter to that. You had this movement of old guard rock and roll purists who were trying to get back to the way music had been made previously without all of the bells and whistles. They just wanted a raw band in a studio recording the sound with as minimal production values as necessary to get a record in the record stores, but as little as possible. They just wanted as much of a raw sound as they could get. So you had these two competing philosophies in the music industry. You had rock bands that embraced technology, like Garbage, Marilyn Manson, Powerman 5000, Limp Bizkit, Rage Against the Machine, Nine Inch Nails, etc., who really found ways to make this new sound really appealing. Even the Prodigy. You had bands that were like taking like music, synth and synth bass and stuff that was pioneered in the nightclubs and the techno music and house music and disco and everything else, but fusing it with rock, with hard rock, and creating new styles of music. One of them was known as nu metal, N-U metal. We also got new disco at the end of the decade, which uses the same spelling convention. Pop embraced technology wholeheartedly, 110%. But you had a handful of folk artists who became big pop sensations in the 90s that were like anti-technology. Not necessarily like anti-technology, but like their music was just acoustic. The most famous one was Jewel, who is a gift from the heavens. And if you don't listen to Jewel, you should, because her music will soothe your soul. But you also had like Natalie Imbruglia. You had Sheryl Crow. You had who else did you have? I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. Paula Cole was a big one. To a lesser extent, Lisa Lowe, but she was very pop. She was very pop. And of course, you had the big one, the Canadian actress, and god damn it, her name is right, Alanis Morissette. It's like I was trying really hard to remember her name, Alanis Morissette. You also, like I said previously, you had the evolution of punk rock, which the big evolution of punk rock in the 90s was the grunge movement, which gave us the alt-rock scene, Nirvana, not Nine Inch Nails, Stone Temple Pilots, Alice in Chains, Collective Soul, etc., etc., etc. But you also had two other forms of post-punk forming in the 90s. One which has its roots in old school rock and roll, and there were some bands experimenting with the sound in the 80s, but this new sound was called ska, and ska really came into its own in the 90s. You had big hits like the big bands like the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Sublime. You had the band that does Walking on the Sun. I can't remember their name of the band right now. Smash Mouth, there it is. You had No Doubt. You had other bands that were experimenting with a ska sound. Cake was in that it was in that family, especially with their hit Mana Mana, which is a good song. Ska really like took the world by storm, especially at the late 90s, going into the early 2000s. And it really, like, you also had like Blink 182, and you had other bands. They weren't all that good. Sum 41, they weren't good. And an offshoot of nu metal you had was rap metal. This gave us shit like Limp Bizkit, the previously mentioned Rage Against the Machine, and God, what was the other rap metal band? I can't even fucking remember their name. They suck. Later on, we'd get Linkin Park. There was one other one in the 90s. Oh, Kid Rock, and he fucking sucked. And this was sort of inspired by the Beastie Boys, who were a punk rock band that turned hip hop, and then kind of experimented with, fusing the sounds in the early 90s. So you had other bands that say, well, if the Beastie Boys can do it, so can we. No. They did it right. Y'all just did it wrong. And then I guess you could probably lump Uncle Kracker in there if you want to. But I don't like to talk about Uncle Kracker because he sucks as well. Now, pop, like mainstream top 40 pop, pretty much was embracing the new technology, the new sound. And you had a lot of big crossover with, like, you had country artists that crossed over into pop. You had jazz and blues artists that crossed over into pop. You had folk artists that I've already mentioned cross over into pop. And then you had a lot of R&B artists cross over into pop, too. You had Mariah Carey. You had Usher was a big, big name. You had the Kings of Motown, Boyz II Men, and other bands like that. You also had TLC. And I would, even though they're more hip-hop, I would lump Salt-N-Pepa in with the R&B crowd more than the rap crowd, just because their hip-hop sounds more R&B than rap. than traditional rap, even though they are a rap band. Especially Very Necessary. That CD sounds very R&B to me. It almost sounds like a TLC album. Which, Left Eye from TLC does rap occasionally, sporadically in some of their songs. And they do have crossover with hip-hop artists, rap artists at the time. Hip-hop referring to the whole broader culture. And when I say hip-hop, I mean rap music. Hip-hop does not mean R&B. I know a lot of people say rap music and they use the word hip-hop to refer to R&B. No, R&B is R&B, hip-hop is rap. Get it right, people. Jesus fucking Christ. It's not that goddamn complicated. I don't know why everybody gets confused on that, but it fucking irritates me. It really does. It's not fucking hard. And then you have I've already done a video on this. You have the introduction of the new sound in the hip-hop world, G-Funk, which I've already done a whole video on. G-Funk was an offshoot of gangster rap, which continues to this day. Not G-Funk, but gangster rap. And you had the introduction of, or not the introduction, but the culmination of the East Coast, West Coast, Bloods versus Crips war, gang war, which culminated with the deaths of Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Tupac and Notorious Fat Ass, who, if you haven't noticed, I am not a fan of Notorious Fat Ass at all. I'm not going to say I was glad he's dead, but I am going to say I'm glad he ain't making music anymore. All right? Take of that what you will. I hated that motherfucker. And I fucking hate Puff Daddy. I've already done a video on how much I hate Puff Daddy. Fuck that guy. He sucks. Now, dance music, you had like dance pop or synth pop come on the scene in the 80s. So you had stuff like, She Blinded Me with Science, or, Amadeus and stuff like that. You Spin Me Right Round, Cars, Burning Down the House, etc. So you had this introduction, this fusion of electronic sounds, synth pop, and just bubblegum or pop. But this really came into its own in the 90s, where you got like the club dance music, or it was sometimes just called dance music. Some people use the word techno to describe this music, but that's not accurate. Techno was a whole different thing. This is where you got stuff like Crush, Jellyhead, you got Crystal Waters, 100% Pure Love, you got Hadaway's What Is Love, and other songs that sound like this. Some of the famous bands of this period would be Aqua, Ace of Base, The Real McCoy. Those were some of the big heavy hitters in this. The LeBach was another one, or LaBouche, however you say it. Those were the pioneers, or the faces of that sound. There were a bajillion imitators, but those were the ones that were like the face of that sound. I would almost put Eiffel 65 in that camp, but they are a little closer to techno or house than some of these other bands. But we're just mincing words at this point. And electronic dance music, or electro music, would really branch out, would take like 100 different branching paths in the 90s. You got techno, you got house, you got tech house, you got club music, you got drum and bass, you got dubstep, you got electronica, you got trip hop, etc. Trance, which is my favorite, my personal favorite. And all kinds of varieties. And I'm not even going to try to parse out what is what, because there's so much disagreement over what is what. I'll let you do your own research on that. Those are just the titles that get thrown around. You can figure out who does what yourself. Some of the big electronic bands or groups or acts of the 90s were like, some of the big ones were like Daft Punk. You had the Crystal Method, the Chemical Brothers. You had Moby. Ugh. And you had Fatboy Slim. Those were the big ones. And Prodigy, which I've already mentioned. Those were the big ones. Also 9 Inch Nails, but they were more like industrial metal, I guess. You still had traditional rock and roll bands and traditional heavy metal bands doing their thing, and heavy metal itself really branched out in the 90s. You got thrasher, and like I said, you got the new metal and some other stuff. Metal, like, just took off in the 90s and branched into all kinds of subcategories. Too many to fucking list or count or even try to parse out. The big names in metal that I haven't already mentioned were the same big names as the 80s. So you still had Kiss, you still had Guns N' Roses, you still had AC/DC a little bit, you still had Def Leppard bouncing around. You had Motley. I don't know if you had Motley Crue in the 90s. They might have like gone by the wayside by then. I don't know. But pretty much Metallica was a big one. The bands that had been doing metal in the 80s were still doing metal in the 90s. And like I said, you got some new bands that came on the scene. Music in the 90s, what I would argue is the most diverse decade of music we've ever had. Things consolidated tremendously in post 90s, post Napster, because the record industry collapsed around 2005, and record stores just disappeared from the face of the earth. The rise of digital music, people stopped buying CDs and records and albums and things, and the rise of iTunes and stuff. So music like consolidated tremendously around a handful of like just big sounds that were gonna break through. So I'm gonna be honest, I haven't listened to hardly anything new since 2005, but I get the impression that like the digital sound took over, and like everything is pretty much digital these days, and like there's not as much diversity in the different genres. Like you have 2, maybe 3 forms of electronic music that dominate. Everything else has just fell by the wayside or is indie now. You know, you have like pop is pop. Pop has always been the same. It's been the same since the beginning of time. I don't know who any of the big acts are. I know Lady Gaga, but I don't even know if she's still relevant or not. Hip hop took a hard left turn around 2003, around the time Ludacris and Kanye West and those motherfuckers took over, and it's been rubbish ever since. There has not been a single hip hop album worth of shit since 2003. The best one we've got are legacy albums by some of the big names. You know, Compton was decent, but not his best work. You know, the Marshall Mathers LP Volume 2 was pretty good, but not as good as the first one. To Pimp a Butterfly can suck my girl cock. I don't know why people sing its fucking praises. I have not heard anything worth a shit since about 2003. I'm just going to be honest. Individual songs, sure. Just not albums. I don't think we've had albums as a thing, like a whole album, cohesive album, since around 2005 or so. I think it's just been singles ever since then. It's just been pop hit after pop hit after pop hit. Some bands still do collect their songs together in albums and release them digitally, as do some of the big names like Taylor Swift and Lady Gaga, as I've already mentioned. But for the most part, albums are a thing of the past. It's just like, you know, you just get like a bunch of singles released until there's enough of them to compile together into either an album or a pseudo album or a, you know, greatest hits or whatever. But the 90s was like, I would argue, the last great decade of music. Now, I'm not arguing music today sucks. I just don't listen to it. I have no exposure to it, and I haven't heard anything that appeals to me other than like Lady Gaga. And like, yeah, I got into LMFAO a little bit. I have their CD. And, you know, Far East Movement, I have their CD. Those broke through to me because I like electronic music, and those were very electro hip hop. But for the most part, it's a lot of fucking rubbish. I do not like what has happened to hip hop, rap music since about 2003. Because it changed. The sound changed, but the way they rap, the cadence of rapping has changed. They don't rap to the beat anymore. They just like try to talk as fast as they can, and they're talking over a really slow beat. And it sounds jarring to me. I want a cadence that matches the beat. Rap to the beat. They don't do that anymore. They just like mesh all their words together, and I can't even parse out what they're saying. And I don't like that. And I don't like the drop. The drop. It's a thing that came on the music scene. I don't know even when it came on the scene, but it like now every dance hit has to have the drop in it. And I fucking hate that. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. If your song, whoever you are, I don't give a shit. If you have to have a drop in the middle of your song, I'm not listening to your fucking song. Just play the god. Give me a break. You're supposed to have a break in the middle of the song where we can actually like stop listening to the artist sing and just dance for like a minute and a half, you know, in your 7-minute dance song. I used to be a break dancer, so you know, I want like to be able to enjoy the music. The drop is stupid. It's like we're just gonna stop the song in the middle of the song and make you hold your breath while we wait for the song to come back on. And I'm like, fuck off. I hate that. I hate the drop. Stop dropping. Stop it. That needs to stop. That just needs to go the fuck away. I can't stand the drop. It's not necessary. And it doesn't build tension. It just stops the song. And you're like, oh, is it over? Oh, never mind. Fuck. God damn it. Fuck. I hate the drop. So yeah, I will argue till the end of time that the 90s was the last great decade of music. Because we got the most diversity in music. Diversity in genres and styles and acts and just experimenting different sounds. Like today, everything sounds the same. It's all produced in a lab somewhere on a computer. It's all made on a laptop. Everything is done on a laptop these days. And it's like, that's not real music. I don't give a fuck what you say. I don't give a fuck if it's what you grew up with and it's all you know. It's not real music. It's just bells and whistles.